Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to the Beta Year program with your host Tariq. Today we will explore and analyze China's role in Asia Pacific, challenges and opportunities for the region. Let me bring our guest in program, Prof.Dr. Pichamon. You are a senior professor and analyst on international relations, especially on Asia Pacific from Australian Defence Force Academy, Australia. Ma'am, thank you so much for joining, and you are most welcome in program.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be on your program.
Ma'am, how would you explain the rise of China in Asia Pacific and Chinese actual power in the region in multilateral perspectives? How would you explain?
Sure. I mean, it's an interesting question, and it's certainly a very big and complex one. I think in order to understand China's rise, we really need to look at it from an historical perspective. We need to, I think, in one sense, understand that China isn't rising per se, but it is a re-emerging power within this region. Certainly, ever since the founding of the People's Republic back in 1949, China has always been a major player within the Asia-Pacific region. But of course, now with its growing diplomatic as well as economic clout, clearly Chinese power, and as others would argue, influence in this region has expanded considerably to the extent that, of course, China now rivals the United States in terms of both hard and soft power capabilities in this region. So I think I can certainly go into much greater detail about how one might explain China's reemergence as a great regional power. But I think it's important to bear in mind that this is something like China's always been a major power in this region. And a big part of this question lies with how we actually define power, but also how we understand how China uses its power and what the end goal is for the Chinese government in particular.
Ma'am, how do other powers like US, Russia, Japan, India see this Chinese rise in Asia Pacific, and what does this mean for these powers? How would you analyze this scenario?
Sure. Again, I think that's a really topical question, and certainly one that we need to ask, especially now given the impact of COVID-19 and how that has really impacted how other countries perceive China and China's handling of this health crisis. I think it's important, of course, just to first note that even for the United States, Russia, Japan, or India, I don't think there is a single unifying or necessarily unifying perspective on China. I think there are multiple perceptions when it comes to how different policy or academic circles view China's rise in the region from the perspective of these countries. And so it's much more multifaceted, much more diverse, and at times contending than I think we give these perspectives credit for. And so if you look at, I work a lot in Southeast Asia, also in the South Pacific. So my interest really is how developing countries engage and view China and Chinese power. And even there, of course, we still need to disaggregate. And we see kind of a spectrum of perspectives. You, of course, get the kind of traditional China as a threat type perspective. You get those that view China as a slightly more benign power. And certainly with China's more recent drive in terms of pushing for infrastructure investment and other forms of trade and investment in this region, this has given rise to the view, of course, that China is in most cases integral to the economic growth of the Asia-Pacific region, although to what extent this then creates vulnerabilities for countries involved varies a lot on the ground, right? So again, I don't think we can kind of come up with a generalized, or it might not be a good idea to come up with a generalized assessment of how other powers in the region view China. But if we had to, it obviously would be the case that for India, there is a degree of strategic ambivalence when it comes to China, and certainly with all of the recent border clashes, it is the case that India is now viewing China as much more of a threat than ever before. Similarly for Japan, I think there's also a degree of strategic ambivalence there as well. But certainly with the revitalization, as I would say, of the Quad, there would appear to be that sense that Japan, along with India, the United States, and Australia, really need to kind of ramp up collaboration and cooperation among and between themselves in order to help manage China's reemergence or flexing of its diplomatic and material capabilities in order to ensure that China's economic and military power actually benefits the common good in this region. So altogether, I suppose what I'm getting at is that what this all means for the US is that the United States also can't assume that all of the countries in this region have a singular or common perception of China, and similarly the same goes for the US as well. Not all of the countries in the region view this US in the same way. Not everyone sees the US as a reliable security guarantor. Not everyone sees the US necessarily as an ally, and likewise, not everyone sees the US as a threat. But so for this reason, both the US and China really need to be mindful of managing the expectations of current and potential allies, and they really need to pay attention to, in one sense, their public relations and how they brand themselves, how they project their identities to other countries in the region, in order to allay any fears of them being a threat to the regional order and stability, but also to reassure countries that their role in this region is meant to contribute to the collective good.
Ma'am, how do China's maritime disputes in the East and South China Sea differs or similar? What is at the stake for the countries involved in this dispute? How would you analyze?
Sure. I think I'll focus a bit more on the South China Sea, given that I've worked in this space before and I still continue to have an abiding interest in it, especially in terms of the role that non-state actors like companies, oil companies in particular, play in this dispute, but also the potential role that civil society actors, for example, can play as well. But I mean, there are other observers have made this point before, that the East China Sea and the South China Sea disputes are different. They're different in terms of, with regard to the East China Sea, China and the other claimant states have been able to kind of, as is popularly said, have been able to shelve the dispute for now. Or so at least that is what is said. And so even though, I mean, compared to the South China Sea, which these days is viewed as the major source of regional, as the major potential source of regional conflict and instability, I think considerably less attention has recently been paid to the East China Sea, and that in part speaks to how, in one sense, Japan, China, and South Korea as well have been able to kind of manage the territorial maritime claims in that area. Not to say that it's perfect, but it certainly is less escalatory compared to the South China Sea. So to focus a bit more on the South China Sea dispute, there is obviously a lot at stake, not least regional security and stability. Certainly for countries like the Philippines, Vietnam, that are and Indonesia as well, that are the kind of among the key countries impacted by China's territorial claims in the South China Sea. The issue also has strong implications for state sovereignty, territorial integrity, as well as even the kind of the domestic legitimacy of the government of the day in these countries. So it's an issue that clearly has very strong nationalistic overtones, and that in part explains the difficulties of managing the dispute, but also in managing the wide-ranging and expansive claims that China has made in relation to the various islets and atolls in that region. And certainly for countries like the Philippines, Vietnam, Indonesia, Malaysia, and so forth, it's also the case that because these countries have close economic relationships with China, they have to ensure that, you know, the kind of the security, the negative security ramifications of the dispute don't spill over to adversely affect their economic relations with China as well. And so there is also a balancing act here at that really heightens the stake for these countries. Similarly, I think we kind of focus a lot on how the littoral states in the South China Sea are impacted by Chinese claims and by this dispute, but it's also important to note that China as well has a lot at stake. I mean, the Chinese government has really made the South China Sea into one of its core national interests, has tied it into the whole discourse around state sovereignty, China's century of humiliation. And so for that reason, it's in one sense, the Chinese government has colored itself into a corner in terms of its inability to really to become more conciliatory or compromise, or to compromise more in this issue area. But of course, I mean, China also has very clear economic and security interests in this region, and a destabilized Southeast Asia or Asia-Pacific region more generally is not going to be conducive to China's economic growth. So in light of that, there's also a clear integral interest for China to try and seek peaceful resolution of the issue, although it remains to be seen what that would actually look like. We know that initiatives are underway. There's been a lot of hope that there will be, the code of conduct will be able to help assist in managing the dispute. But if recent actions on the Chinese side in particular are anything to go by, the concern in Southeast Asia is that, and certainly in Australia and in the US, is that China has become much more assertive in this region, and that does not bode well, but it also limits opportunities for meaningful cooperation between Beijing and the other claimant parties.
Ma'am, how do you view China's future role in Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation, or APEC? How would you analyze?
Again, it's a big question. It's certainly a complex one, and one can go into issues, to do with trade liberalization, what it means for China's own domestic reform, especially for state enterprise reform, and so on and so forth. I mean, clearly, and again, looking back a bit more historically, China has always sought to play a key role in APEC. It has sought to help, it has sought to play a major role in shaping the international trade and investment architecture. And most recently, it has also pledged millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars, I should say, to support APEC activities and events as well. So there is no doubt that China is important to APEC and to the kind of to intra-regional trade, but also to liberalizing trade and investment within this region. And certainly there have been studies done in the past which indicate how China also would stand to gain from greater trade liberalization and investment within this region. So it's a win-win, to put it that way. That being said, I mean, I am being very general here, and I'm only really scratching the surface when I say all of this. Clearly, there are still barriers There are some barriers to deepening the level of regional integration that we see, especially in the Asia-Pacific. And despite initiatives like RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, even with kind of the CPTPP, so the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, and the other big one, of course, is the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, or RCEP, as I mentioned earlier. There are still, I think there are still barriers to further regional economic integration in this region, and certainly the question remains: to what extent is China able and willing to contribute to this push for greater regional economic integration, but also to what extent do other countries in the region actually want to further integrate their economies with the Chinese economy and so forth. So I don't think there is enough time for me to go into the details, but suffice it to say that China is incredibly important, of course, to the economic future of the Asia-Pacific region, as well as to cooperation within this space. And we've certainly seen how trade wars between the US and China, but also between Australia and China, have negatively impacted not just kind of supply chains and trade between these countries, but equally it has negatively impacted confidence amongst other countries in the Asia-Pacific region about, the kind of the economic the stability of the regional economic order, but also their confidence in China as well. So it's been very interesting, especially with COVID-19, to see how countries in the region have tried to gradually diversify away from China, and also to diversify supply chains to become less reliant on China in light of these trade wars, and that kind of pervasive sense of economic uncertainty.
What are the challenges do you observe for China in Asia-Pacific region in terms of economic and security cooperation, especially during or after the COVID-19 pandemic? How would you analyze this whole scenario?
I mean, again, I think that's that's the question that everyone has on their minds, I think. Certainly, again, with COVID-19, there's just an incredible amount of uncertainty. And I think we're all kind of trying to make sense of what the world will look like once this pandemic ends, and hopefully it will end soon. And given that China has been spotlighted throughout this entire pandemic, it's not surprising, of course, that the question really is, like, how can China improve its relationship with countries, and the kind of the relative loss in confidence that other countries have in China and its ability to manage these globally destabilizing issues, like, and specifically in the non-traditional security realm, whether it be climate change, pandemics, or something else. So in terms of key issues and opportunities, needless to say, COVID remains the ongoing issue that China will continue to have to grapple with. And it clearly isn't sufficient for Beijing to just simply invest in what some would call mass diplomacy, or health diplomacy. It's not enough for Beijing just to be trying to change people's perceptions of the country through messaging and other such initiatives. It's equally important for Beijing or the Chinese government to be putting, kind of really investing into developing the resources, the PPE, the kind of the sound and trustworthy equipment that can be shared and sent to countries that are currently experiencing the pandemic's kind of second, third, or even fourth waves. And here, India, other parts of Southeast Asia come into mind. So the COVID-19 pandemic in that regard presents a very obvious challenge, but it also presents clear opportunities for Beijing to engage more with the region in a way that is not just about, again, PR messaging, but actually about providing resources, providing the support for countries to overcome this ongoing crisis. At the same time, again, with exciting economic initiatives like RCEP and others, there is also an opportunity for Beijing to play a bigger role in terms of encouraging economic growth, development in this region. And I don't think it's enough for Beijing to simply just be touting the Belt and Road Initiative or to simply be driving investment specifically in the infrastructure space. There's also a need for Beijing to help set best practice standards when it comes to these issues in the region as well. And certainly that is one of the areas that China has received the most negative publicity, among one of the key issues that Beijing has received some really negative publicity, given how Chinese investment projects have sometimes attracted plenty of criticism from host countries and host societies. So if China wants to become a major economic player, it can't just be providing the monetary or the wealth, right, that funds these initiatives. It also actually needs to, in one sense, reform its behavior, implement clearer and more stringent guidelines for better practice amongst its state-owned enterprises, its multinational private companies, but also in order to ensure that these investment projects are actually beneficial to host countries themselves. So I think there's a real opportunity there. And if Beijing is able to do that, if China is able to do that, then I think it would mean that China's economic leadership in the region, especially when it comes to the Belt and Road Initiative and infrastructure investment, might be more warmly received by other countries in the Asia-Pacific. And I suppose, finally, I think the point, as we've been seeing in Australia, is that there is, at the end of the day, the most important, perhaps, or the most valuable asset that a country can have is actually trust and credibility. I think these are assets that obviously you cannot acquire in a day, and they are assets or attributes that you can only cultivate over a period of time. And as others have said before, or I've observed before, China often suffers from an accountability deficit, meaning that because its operations, its behavior can be quite opaque to others, it's hard for other countries to trust China and to understand the intentions and the motivations behind Chinese actions. So in light of that, I think there's also an opportunity, given COVID-19, for China to recast itself, to recast its identity, and to reconsider how it behaves and engages with other countries. It will only continue to be the case, I think, that as issues like cybersecurity, artificial intelligence, and so forth, especially in that domain, start to flare up as becoming sources of state insecurity, that China, given that it's one of the key players in this domain as well, really needs to invest even more resources, even more effort into reassuring other countries in this region of its intentions, but also in making some of its decisions more transparent. It's going to be incredibly hard, I imagine, and potentially not even possible. But again, I think for this region, given how the reactions that countries like Australia and the United States have had to rising Chinese influence or perceived influence, there is a real need for Beijing, for China to show that it is perhaps not what other countries have cast it to be so far. And in order to do so, there needs to be greater transparency and accountability in how China behaves and in the policies that it pursues.
Ma'am, thank you so much for your valuable analysis on China's role in Asia-Pacific region. Thank you so much again for your time in Debate IR.
Yeah, thank you. My pleasure.